Welcome to the Vine Resources podcast show.
Welcome to today's edition of the Vine Resources podcast show. I'm delighted today to have with me Matt Clifford. Matt is the co-founder and CEO of Entrepreneur First. Matt, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Matt, why don't we just get straight in there and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and the company, please?
Sure, yeah. So Entrepreneur First is a company that I started with Alice, my co-founder, in 2011. And we start from a very simple premise, which is that the world is missing out on some of its best founders. So we believe that founding a company in the 21st century ought to be the number one career choice for the world's most ambitious people. And we see our role, our mission is to make that the case. And the way we do that is that we solve the problems that stop the world's most ambitious people starting companies. Most importantly, we think having the best co-founder for them. So we think it's very hard to find a world-class co-founder and very hard to develop a world-class idea. So what we do is we, every 6 months in London and in Berlin and in Singapore, we bring together 50 to 100 super smart, super ambitious, super committed individuals to explore co-founding together. And then we take them right through seed funding until they have a company that's funded by, we hope some of the world's top investors.
Fantastic. And I know you've got about 70 people in the company as well, haven't you?
Yeah, so 70 people work at EF. We funded about 120 companies. Today they're worth about $1 billion. We've done about $250 million of exits, and we're backed by some of the world's leading investors, people like Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, Founders Fund, it's about Tesla and SpaceX and Airbnb and many, many more.
Fantastic. Well, look, can you share with our listeners what a typical day in the business looks like for you then?
Yeah, so my role as CEO is, I suppose, threefold. One, to make sure we have the right strategy. Two, to make sure we have the right team. And three, to make sure there's money in the bank, both for us to spend on our operations and to invest in the companies that we help to build. So most of my time is spent on one of those three. So typically I'll spend time with our senior team, kind of whichever geography they happen to be in. One of the big challenges is running a team that spans, we also have a very small office in Boston, so we actually span 13 time zones, which is a bit of a challenge. So typically start early with Singapore and finish late with Boston. I might also catch up with one of our investors and tell them how things are going and explain the kind of plans for the year ahead. I'm also very likely to spend time with some of our alumni, some of the people who've been through EF, graduated, and are now building their own companies and helping them think through the biggest challenges that they face. So it's very people intensive, typically spending a lot of time talking directly with our most important stakeholders, and that's our team or our investees or our investors. And then as much as I can, I also try and carve out time to actually think and make sure that we're winning on the strategy side as well, and that we're doing the right things to allow us to grow to be a globally important institution, which is the goal.
Can you perhaps think about or name a person that's had tremendous impact on you as a leader?
Yeah, I think I've been extremely lucky with the people who have been my mentors and advisors kind of throughout my career. I started my career as a management consultant at McKinsey in London, and there were definitely people there who remained hugely influential in how I think about leadership. I was very fortunate to spend a lot of time working with the man who's now the chair of McKinsey's Asia business, Kevin Sneeder, who was very supportive to me early on, and then some of the people who are kind of partners in London, particularly a guy called Chris Wigley, who was one of my first bosses and taught me an awful lot. But then as I transitioned into the kind of startup world and investment world, again, kind of have been able to work very closely with people who have really, I suppose, changed the way I think about what it means to try and do things at scale, which is a big theme that runs through what we do at EF and how we help our companies. I suppose most recently, we had a big round of investment that we raised, led by Reid Hoffman, who I mentioned before, the founder of LinkedIn. He joined our board, and he's been a tremendous support to us as we think about what it means to scale EF to the next level. Having scaled LinkedIn himself and now being an investor in some of the world's most prominent companies, I just find that he's able to distill down in a very short amount of time some of the lessons seen from watching kind of preeminent companies achieve the scale they have.
Fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic to hear. And I'm curious to ask you about employee engagement, both in your own company, but also in the companies that you support. So what do you do from the top to keep your employees engaged, and what do you see the successful companies that you've brought through do from the top?
I think it really has to start with mission. That's how we think about EF. I think that we live in a world now where people don't expect at all to have a job for life, and do expect to move on and move between companies rapidly, often kind of staying only a couple of years. Our aim at EF is to have people want to stay longer than that, obviously, but also to make moving on from EF a very positive thing, and a thing that actually builds value both for EF and for them. So having Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel as investors in EF, one of the exciting things is they have the very positive story about PayPal, a company that Peter founded and Reid was on the board of. People now talk about the PayPal mafia, which is the kind of alumni of PayPal, which includes the founders of YouTube, people like Elon Musk, founder of Tesla and SpaceX, the founders of many of the iconic businesses, and they very consciously built this idea that kind of being ex-PayPal was a really valuable thing. So kind of one thing that we talk about is, if we want to be the world's most important institution for building companies, then that means kind of having a very positive view about people's career trajectories both within and outside EF. That's one way, is that we're very positive about that. As I say, I think it is about mission, and about having mission that people are really bought into. So we always say our mission is to build the world's most important companies by creating the most valuable career paths for the most ambitious people. And we think that's a mission that appeals to people with a sense of ambition. It's really about doing something on a global scale, but also to a commitment to impact. It's really about building companies not just that are valuable and are going to produce great returns for our investors and for the team, but also actually going to have an important impact. So which is why, if you look at our portfolio, you'll see not just another dating app or another way of buying nappies one day quicker or 5 cents cheaper, but people trying to solve big, meaty, important problems from the world. Kind of how do we discover new kinds of life-saving drugs? How do we build security systems that protect the world's most important assets? How do we radically improve the productivity of agriculture? These are sort of big, chunky problems that our companies work on at EF, and I think that in turn makes EF an inspiring place to work.
I'm going to go off subject a little bit, because I want to go back to something you said at the start that I think is important. If I was listening to this show on the podcast and I thought, I've got a really life-changing idea, I want to share it with you, what's the criteria for, you talked about, passion, hungry, super, driven people, but what's the criteria that you look for in the people that you're having conversations with and going, okay, that's the kind of people we're interested in. Those are the people we want to talk to have the next big thing?
Yeah. Well, we have a very unusual model at EF, which means my answer to that question is probably quite different from the answer you would get if you spoke to most venture capitalists. And that's because we start pre-company. So when people join us, they often don't have a company at all. We're often taking them on as an individual founder, which means that the characteristics we're looking for are not the characteristics of the idea, but very much of the person. And so we talk about a number of things. Some of them are kind of obvious and table stakes. Others, I think, are a little bit less obvious. So, the obvious ones, we want people who are smart. I always say entrepreneurship is applied problem solving. We want people who can solve problems of all kinds that are thrown at them without warning and across a broad range of contexts. That's kind of a given. Second, we want people who are committed. There is a slight danger as entrepreneurship becomes more popular, then it almost becomes like another badge to collect. Oh yeah, sure, I started a company. We're not very interested in that kind of entrepreneur. We're not interested in that kind of founder. So a big thing we're screening for is commitment. Like, why does this person want to do what they say they want to do? And is that something that's likely to sustain them through the roller coaster ride that is starting a startup? The third is insightful. So one thing that I think isn't talked about enough is that the marketplace for ideas is extremely competitive. I don't just mean like when people actually start companies. I just mean even, the kind of like down the pub, I had this great ideas. Those ideas tend to be ideas that are thought of by millions of people all around the world. So the most important question an entrepreneur can ask themselves is, why now? Why hasn't this been done before if this is such a great idea? And we think the answer is usually that important ideas contain a contrarian insight, an insight that most people would say, that's got to be wrong, that can't be right. And so one thing we look for very clearly during our selection process is, can this person come up with an insight that is non-obvious? Can they tell us something that isn't something that a smart outsider would say, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense? We think if you look at the history of iconic companies, there's always that contrarian insight. So the ability to generate that is extremely important. So we think if you find a smart, committed individual who can also be insightful, that takes you an awful long way down the road. And then we layer onto that things like resilience, determination, a lot of these kind of classic founder traits that you really want to make sure of that.
Matt, thanks so much for sharing that. It's really good to get your insights into your thinking. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing business leaders today?
Well, I think it's sort of a very broad question, but one for sure is a thing we've already touched on, which is how do you attract and retain world-class talent in a jobs market where the most skilled and most talented individuals have global choices thrown at them all day, every day, and they don't have to stay. And I think actually what's interesting about that challenge is it applies across all industries, across the public sector, private sector, social sector. And certainly when I see kind of my peers in our industry, talent is almost always in their top 2 or 3 priorities. So I think that's certainly a big one. I think the other one is it's sort of competition coming from more places. It's a cliche to talk about living in a globalized world, but I think particularly in tech, what's striking is geography just matters less and less and less, particularly as companies scale. So it's no longer enough to know that you're the best at what you do in your home city. Increasingly, you want to know what are the smartest, most secretive people in, say, China, who probably aren't publishing what they're doing in English, and so won't be easily Googleable. What are they doing, and how do you win when they're competing? And I think those two things come together because it also means that talent now has opportunities far outside, the market that you might be used to competing in when it comes to retaining talent. And certainly that's one of the great educations for us in opening up the Singapore office, was just being exposed to the extremely vibrant and competitive landscape in Southeast Asia, and that's been very exciting and as I say, very educational.
Fantastic. Hopefully you're not getting too jet lagged jumping back and forth between all the time zones.
Well, I have a 12-day-old baby, so that kind of more than it's worse than any jet lag I've ever experienced.
Congratulations anyway. It can only get easier. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
Well, I think there are different types of advice that are appropriate for different stages. But if I think about my day job, which is working with people at the very, very start of their journey, I think the single most important piece of advice is stay close to your customers. It's extremely easy to get carried away with what you might call the paraphernalia of startup life, the going to networking events and having business cards printed and kind of podcasting. It's very easy for people to, by the way, I love being on podcasts, but kind of it would have been absolutely the wrong thing for me to focus on in the first 3 months of this company's life. We're sort of 6 years old now. And I think staying close to your core business of who is it whose problem you're really trying to solve, and how can you make sure that you have the deepest insights, to go back to that idea, of anyone in the world about that problem, that I think is invaluable. And I always get very anxious when I see our portfolio companies spending a lot of time at networking events or getting distracted by anything that isn't just talking to their customers and building a product to solve those customers' needs.
Fabulous advice there. How do you help a new employee understand the culture of your company? Or again, how have you seen the successful companies you've taken through do that?
I think the most important thing is stories. I believe in a way that culture is an accumulation of shared stories. And, I think sometimes people get this the wrong way around, and they say, well, if we have great values and we tell people what the values are, then kind of that will stay with them, and the values will kind of underpin our culture. And that's absolutely right. But values, in a way, must be embodied in the stories that you tell about your company. Values that are disconnected from behavior aren't really values. The way we do it at EF is we do have, as I said, I've already quoted our mission to you. We have values that are very important to what we do, but we always start story first. We always say, for every value, there has to be multiple stories that show us living this value in practice. If we tell those stories and they become part of the fabric of life for Entrepreneur First, then actually it's very easy to communicate and share and replicate and disseminate those values, even as we expand to offices around the world where we can't all be physically with each other the whole time. So I think stories. I think founders' main job is to be the storyteller in chief.
What's the one mistake you witness business leaders making more frequently than others?
Well, I think one kind of obvious answer is doing the opposite of what we just talked about with customers, so getting caught up in other things. But I suppose to give a slightly different answer, I think another mistake is to forget that really you can't. Being a leader means you have to have followers. I think when I see our companies that do less well, that implode in the first sort of year or two, often it's a question of ego. It's a question of leaders sort of making the company about them and making the mission about them. I think you have to build a company that can survive without you. There's that amazing Warren Buffett quote about, you kind of should only invest in companies that can be led by an idiot, because one day they will be. Kind of obviously, I more than anyone believe in the importance of founders, because that's what my whole business is based on. But on the other hand, that means that the responsibility of founders is to try and build a culture, build an infrastructure, build systems and processes that allow the company to thrive without them being personally involved in everything. And I think that kind of, when you actually build a company where you as the founder are the kind of single point of failure, that's when you get into a lot of problems.
I think that's brilliant advice there. How do you think you see your industry changing in the next few years, and how do you think that'll affect the ability to attract, hire, and retain the best talent?
Yeah, it's a really exciting. Probably all industries feel like this, but the venture capital industry, which is ultimately the kind of business we're in, is really after a very sort of quite tired first 40 years or so, kind of suddenly finding a whole range of challenges that really kind of coming from within, in that coming largely from the tech industry itself. In other words, the people that we fund are often trying to eat us. In fact, I would sort of describe EF as an attempt to eat a part of the venture capital industry. That's accelerating now. Some of the key trends that are making that happen are the rise of different types of crowdfunding, so the ability to bypass venture capitalists altogether in raising money for entrepreneurs. Most prominently at the moment, the kind of rise of cryptocurrencies, and in particular this funding mechanism that we call the ICO, the initial coin offering, where people have raised sometimes tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars without ever going near a venture capitalist. That's a very interesting challenge. I'm a little bit skeptical it will eat the whole industry, but it certainly increases the pressure on VCs to justify their role in the ecosystem. So that's certainly one way. I think another is the increasing internationalization of funding. I already mentioned some of the people that funded us. They didn't care that we weren't in their backyard, and that in fact we were thousands of miles away. I think capital has a way of finding the best opportunities, which again means that venture capitalists are not competing with the people they meet at networking events in their home city. They're competing with the very best investors in the world. So I think the people who will be able to attract and retain talent in that environment are the people who can actually, ironically, tell a story about their funding model that is as robust as the stories they would expect to hear from an entrepreneur. So it almost used to be that venture capital was a slightly lazy game. You kind of raised a fund, you put up a sign saying you got money, and then entrepreneurs would pile through your door and basically beg you for it. Those days are gone, and increasingly funds have to be able to compete as companies as well as just providers of capital, and people who have a compelling story about why their funding business has network effects, has scalability, has the ability to produce kind of long-term differentiated returns, they're the people that are going to be able to attract the talent that makes such a strategy work.
Matt, thank you for sharing that, and I'm really glad you brought up cryptocurrencies, because I was going to ask you about that in the investor circle. Look, Matt, if you had your time again, you were giving your 20-year-old self advice. This is pre-children, by the way, of course. If you're giving your 20-year-old self advice, what's the one thing you would say?
Well, I think one thing is to realize that you have time. I think I spent a lot of time when I was 20, which is kind of reasonably long time ago now, worrying desperately about what I was going to do with my life. And I think I took a very top-down approach to that. So I was very much like, what are the most prestigious institutions, and how do I make sure I have the badges of those institutions? And in a way, that's not a terrible heuristic. It didn't lead me to any bad places, but actually, I think it's not the right way, and increasingly, it will be the wrong way in the 21st century for ambitious people to think about their lives. And the reason is that I think increasingly it's going to be more about what are the networks that you are in where you're demonstrating as much value as possible from day one. That's going to be the kind of thing that defines the early career stage for most people. So in a way, as I said, I started my career at McKinsey, and McKinsey was a great badge to have, kind of opened, if I'd wanted to go into the corporate world, which I didn't, it would have opened up an awful lot of doors. But the reason it works as a badge is that it basically tells you, oh, this person got through the door there, so you don't need to do any more due diligence. Don't worry, they got through the door. But what it doesn't do, partly because in the old world it was impossible to do, is really show you what is that person capable of? What have they actually built? What have they actually demonstrated? How have they done valuable things? I think increasingly there's a transparency around that. When I hire people today, I'm less looking at the badges on their CV and more saying, show me something you've actually done. Ideally, that you're not just bringing to an interview, but I can see transparently online. Kind of building an identity and a personal brand around not what you say, but what you actually do is an increasingly important part of, I think, kind of building a career. And I think so if I was speaking to the 20-year-old version of me today, I'd say take more risks, put yourself out there more, be willing to kind of say things publicly, say things online, kind of form an opinion, demonstrate that you're valuable, not just that you have the badges that sort of hint at that.
Lovely advice there, Matt. And Matt, what's the best way, and thank you, by the way, first of all, for sharing so many fabulous insights. What's the best way for people to reach out to you? Maybe that person in the pub that's got that amazing idea, but a little bit further. But what's the best way for people to reach out for you if they're interested in finding out more about Entrepreneur First, EF?
Yeah, so the first thing I say is you cannot be too early for EF. We want to speak to individuals purely on the basis of their own talent, skills, and ambitions. So even if you have no idea, but you have, you think you have an exceptional set of skills to offer, we want to hear from you. You can go to our website, which is joinef.com, joinef.com, and you can read lots more about how we support entrepreneurs and how to apply there. You can also find me on Twitter, where I am fairly accessible and happy to answer questions and talk about what we do. And I'm Matthew Clifford on Twitter.
Matt, thank you so much for sharing that. And look forward to checking in maybe in another year's time to hear how it's gone.
Thank you so much.